Climate change is an issue that is described by a two-level game in political science. That is, you have to do both at the same time. You can't just prioritize one or the other, because the international structure affects the foreign policy issues and the domestic politics, affects the costs and the benefits to states, and therefore the reactions of domestic groups. And of course, domestic politics shapes what states can do, and therefore shapes their bargaining positions and the credibility of their negotiating positions. So you have to do this simultaneously. That's why one reason it's so difficult. It requires this mutual back and forth. And this is also true of trade, for example. Trade is also a two-level game. You only get a trade agreement if you both get a negotiation among the major trading partners, and at the same time you get domestic agreement on the trade agreement. So it's a common phenomenon in international politics, but it means you can't make a choice between one or the other level. You have to do both sequentially and simultaneously. You have to start with the basic problem, which is that it's difficult to find incentives that are self-interested for states and leaders to pursue a responsible climate policy. And we've had a hard time doing this. The first best way to do it is with some sort of international agreement that everybody agrees to, but we have failed at doing that, so far at least. So Jeffrey Brennan and Philip Pettit have a book on the economy of esteem, a general book about 5 or 6 years ago, and they point out that prizes and prestige and reputation can be important incentives for leaders. So we could think about ways in which we could give prizes to states for taking advance action, prizes to cities or to corporations, some sort of awards, distinction for people who take initiatives on climate change, that is giving them reputational incentives to act in a way they otherwise, on purely material basis, wouldn't act. It's one way to sort of think outside the box, as we say. That is, try to think about ways that will not be the principal way. I'm not at all saying this is the principal way to solve climate change. But in the presence of a deadlock on the traditional ways of doing it, it's one way to think about getting some action from some people in some contexts. Well, I think it's the best way that I have seen so far, because although you may not call it cap and trade anymore, and it's going to be very complicated, but the basic architecture has the advantage that it enables resources to be transferred from richer countries that are more willing to take action to poorer countries that are reluctant to have binding commitments without public funds explicitly being sent. So that if you set up a situation where there were caps on everybody, but the caps on developing countries came into force later, or were high enough that there was space, so-called hot air, between the level of their actual emissions and the cap, and they could sell the credits for that amount into the world market or into national carbon markets. So cap and trade is a way of giving material incentives to reluctant developing countries to actually take action. Now, so far they haven't decided to do this, partly because the actions by developed countries have not been sufficiently credible, especially the United States, and partly because they're reluctant to accept a binding limit in a condition of uncertainty. But the basic principle of market-driven flows of funds that provide incentives to developing countries is, I think, going to have to be part of any climate architecture. It may not be called cap and trade. It may have lots of different variations to it. There may be safety valves and ways to reassure developing countries that they aren't locked into a certain cap which they then can't meet effectively. But something like it, some adaptation of it, I think will have to be part of the global structure. All of the above, because you can't separate them very well. That is, you can analyze them somewhat separately, but take energy market and climate emissions. Those are inseparable, right? You change the nature of the energy market and you change climate emissions one way or the other. If you look at different sectors, that of course affects the general pattern. And the international politics part involves especially the question of bargaining, how the commitments are going to be made vis-a-vis others' commitments, and also the question of compliance. That is how you arrange patterns so that once agreements have been made in a very decentralized environment, without any normally hierarchical way of forcing compliance, how you use reciprocity in some form to give incentives to states to comply with their commitments, or at least to come close enough. They don't have to always totally comply, to come close enough that they're actually doing something worthwhile. It's a different to talk about which are the most important players than to say which players can determine the outcomes in the system. China and the U.S. are the most important players, each of them emitting approximately the same amount, roughly 20% of world emissions. But so that without them, nothing will happen, and no other blocs, except maybe Europe and to some limited extent, will take major action without the U.S. and China acting. So their action is necessary, but it's not sufficient. They can't dictate terms. Europe is a major actor. India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Russia are in different ways major actors. And the combination of everyone else is also substantial. So if you take the 17 or 18 major emitting countries, they account for about 85% of emissions. So all or almost all of them have to somehow be included, although the U.S. and China have to take the lead, and as long as the U.S. and China are not taking the lead, which they're not yet, then everybody else will not just use them as an excuse not to act, but it will rightly see that they can't really act from an economic point of view unless the U.S. and China take action. So they are the key to the logjam, but they're not. It's not a bipolar world. They can't dictate. And you can imagine some set of rules that they could propose that everybody else would say this is terrible. For example, rules that were especially helpful to the U.S. and China and bad for everybody else. So they can't. It's not a bipolar world, but you might call it a world of dual leadership or potential leadership.